In the glittering halls of a royal palace, a proud prince turns a servant's inexperience into a spectacle of humiliation. But beneath her lowered gaze, a quiet fire is lit, a resolve that drives her to master the very art used to belittle her. Night after night she learns in secret, every step a defiance, every turn a promise. And when the grand ball arrives, the court will watch in stunned silence as the one they dismissed takes the lead in the waltz and turns the game against the crown. The chandeliers blazed in the mirrored gallery, scattering prisms of gold and crystal light across the polished floor. Beyond the open archways, the grand ballroom breathed with movement. A sea of gowns in shades of wine, ivory, and deep sapphire, swirling in the measured rhythm of the orchestra. Every corner of the Palace of Versailles seemed alive, waxed parquet gleaming like liquid amber, the air scented with beeswax polish, jasmine perfume, and the faintest trace of wood smoke drifting from the hearths. The walls seemed to hum with the conversations of nobles and foreign dignitaries, voices bright with intrigue and laughter. Claire Beaumont moved along the periphery, balancing a silver tray laden with slender crystal glasses. Her uniform was plain, its crisp linen apron stark against the dark wool of her dress, the colors dulled beside the rippling sheen of silk and satin surrounding her. She kept her eyes lowered to avoid notice, her step measured to avoid disturbing the currents of the dance. The click of her shoes on the polished floor was lost beneath the steady swell of strings and the low, velvety thrum of the bass viol. A waltz began, its three-beat pulse gliding through the ballroom like a single breath drawn and released. In the center, Prince Etienne de Valcourt moved with unstudied elegance, his hand resting lightly at the waist of his partner. His black hair caught the light in a sheen, his profile sharp as the edge of a cameo. The ladies who were not his partner watched him openly, their fans fluttering like the wings of impatient birds. He led the dance with the precision of a man accustomed to every gaze following him, each turn executed as if to remind the court that he alone ruled this floor. When the final chord faded, applause rippled through the crowd. The prince bowed to his partner and released her with a smile that promised nothing and suggested everything. As the dancers dispersed, he glanced toward the edge of the floor, and his gaze caught on Claire. For a moment she thought it was accidental, the idle sweep of a bored man's attention. But then the corner of his mouth curved, and he began to move toward her. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier. She shifted her grip, the cool metal biting against her palms, and stepped backward into the shadow of a gilded pillar. He reached her in 3 measured strides, the faint scent of bergamot and something darker, cedar perhaps, accompanying him. With a flourish, he extended his hand, palm up, as though inviting her to step onto the floor. The motion was theatrical enough to draw the notice of those nearby, their laughter quick to follow. The prince's eyes gleamed. "Waiting?" Claire hesitated, her heart quickening, and in that instant he withdrew his hand with an elegant bow that carried the weight of dismissal. He remarked, loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear, on the misfortune of one so near to the music, yet untouched by its grace. A murmur of amusement rolled through the onlookers, the sound amplified by the ballroom's soaring ceilings. Several ladies glanced her way with the faint smirk of those accustomed to harmless cruelty, the kind that costs them nothing. Claire's face warmed, the heat creeping along her neck until she feared it showed. She lowered her eyes and stepped back, focusing on the steady rise and fall of the tray in her hands. The polished crystal trembled faintly with her movement, catching the light like fragments of ice. The prince had already turned away, reclaimed by a knot of laughing courtiers. She could have fled to the kitchens, let the heat and noise there swallow her shame. but she held her ground, standing just within the shadow of the pillar, each heartbeat sharp in her chest. The laughter faded into the general swell of voices and music, but the echo of it lingered inside her, as tangible as the weight of the silver tray. Beneath the sting of humiliation, something else took root, quiet, fierce, and immovable. Her fingers tightened around the tray's handles until the metal pressed sharply against her skin. She swallowed, forcing her expression into stillness, and turned to make her way toward the far edge of the gallery. The music swelled again, the orchestra coaxing couples back to the floor, the sheen of movement like water glinting under candlelight. She stepped away from the pillar and into the corridor that would take her beyond the ballroom's reach, the tray balanced with practiced precision. But before she could take more than a few paces, a shadow slid across her path, halting her mid-step. A figure stood there, barring the way, his posture deliberate and his face unreadable. Jacques Morel stood in the narrow passage, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, the long shadow of his frame stretching across the marble tiles. His gray hair was pulled neatly at the nape, his coat cut with the severe elegance of a man who valued precision over comfort. Candlelight from a wall sconce traced the deep lines around his eyes that now studied Claire with the practiced scrutiny of a craftsman assessing raw material. He did not speak at once. The sounds of the ballroom reached them faintly, muffled by the thick walls, a flourish of violins, a distant ripple of laughter. Claire shifted her weight, unsure whether to step around him or retreat. Her pulse still pounded from the prince's mockery, the heat of it clinging to her as if it were a physical thing. Jacques moved at last, stepping to one side to let her pass, though his gaze followed her. His voice, when it came, was low and clipped, yet carried an undercurrent of intent. He had seen what had happened. More importantly, he had seen her reaction. Not the bowing of the head that most in her position might adopt, but something steadier, something that had stiffened her spine rather than bent it. Without flourish or pity, he told her she could learn the waltz, not in the careless fashion of a kitchen maid imitating noble steps, but properly, with every turn and glide as exact as the measure of the music. He offered no comfort, only the blunt outline of an arrangement. After her duties each night, she would come to the practice hall. There would be no witnesses. The work would be grueling, the hours long. Claire hesitated, the words weighing heavily on her. She could walk away and consign herself to being nothing more than a momentary jest for a bored prince, or she could face something harder than humiliation, discipline, repetition, the daily reminder of what she was not yet capable of. The memory of laughter in the ballroom tipped the balance. She nodded once, almost sharply. Jacques' expression did not change, though a flicker of something, approval perhaps, moved briefly across his features. He turned without another word and strode down the corridor, leaving her with the lingering scent of polished leather and the faint creak of his shoes on the marble. She stood for a moment longer, feeling the decision settle into her like a stone sinking in still water. Hours later, when the palace had quieted and the guests had withdrawn to private chambers, she slipped away from the servants' quarters. The practice hall lay in a secluded wing, its high windows dark against the night sky. She pushed the door open to find the room aglow with the steady light of candelabras. The wax scent mingled with the faint tang of resin on the polished floor. Jacques was already there, standing at the far end with a slender cane in one hand. He tapped it lightly against the boards, producing a faint, regular beat. Without preamble, he gestured for her to remove her apron. Her hands felt clumsy as she untied the strings, folding the linen on a nearby chair. The first step he taught her was simple in theory, impossibly complex in execution. She placed her feet where he indicated, the wood cool beneath her thin soles. At his nod, she began to move. Slowly, awkwardly, her shoes scraping faintly. The sound made him halt her with a rap of the cane against the floor. "Again," he ordered. She tried once more, concentrating on the rhythm he counted out. Again, he stopped her. The repetition wore on, each failed attempt pricking her patience. Sweat gathered at the nape of her neck, despite the winter chill that seeped faintly through the windows. Her arms ached from holding them in position. Her calves burned. Jacques' instructions were brief, his corrections exact, but he offered no praise when she managed a sequence without stumbling. Instead, he set her immediately to the next. Minutes blared into an hour, the flicker of candles marking the slow advance of time. Her body protested with each movement, yet something within her pushed back harder. She began to sense the pattern in the steps, the way the weight shifted like the tide, forward and back, turn and sweep. The floor seemed less a cold surface beneath her, and more an element she could shape if only she learned its laws. A sharp misstep broke her concentration. Her heel slid slightly, her balance tipping. She caught herself with a hand outstretched, breath coming faster now.
Jacques' voice cut through the air, sharp, about to correct her, but then he stopped. His head turned toward the far end of the room. The silence in the hall thickened. Somewhere behind her, the hinges of the door gave a long, slow creak. A young man stood in the doorway, framed by the dim corridor beyond. The light from the candelabras drew a faint sheen across the brass buttons of his livery. His fair hair caught the glow as he stepped inside. The velvet bundle in his arms held with care. Claire straightened, her breath still uneven from practice, and the sharp scent of candle smoke from the hall drifted in behind him. Jacques' cane tapped once against the floor, the sound neither welcoming nor dismissing. The young man hesitated before speaking, his voice quiet but steady. He explained he was returning a velvet chair cover to the storage room adjoining the practice hall. The explanation hung in the air, plausible enough, though his eyes, gray and intent, moved between Claire and the dance master with a knowing weight. Claire's fingers curled slightly against her skirt. A flush rose at the thought of her secret spilling into the endless whisper chain of the servants' quarters. The palace was vast, but rumors moved faster than footfalls. She could almost hear the echo of laughter if word reached the wrong ears. Yet the young man did not smile, nor did he look at her with the faint contempt she had endured in the ballroom. Instead, he shifted the bundle under his arm and offered to fetch a pitcher of fresh water from the kitchens. His reasoning was simple. The hall was warm from the candelabras, and the work of dance could dry one's throat faster than expected. Jacques' pace narrowed, weighing the offer. After a moment, he gave no answer, turning back toward Claire as if the intrusion were no more than a stray draft. The young man took that silence for permission. He disappeared into the corridor, his footsteps fading quickly, leaving behind only the faint creak of the door's hinges as it closed. Jacques resumed the lesson without comment, snapping the cane lightly in rhythm. Claire followed the count, her steps more deliberate now, her mind alert to the possibility of another interruption. The door opened again after several minutes. The young man returned, this time setting a narrow glass and a tall clay pitcher on a side table near the wall. In his other hand he carried a small brass lantern, the flame within steady. Without asking, he crossed to a shadowed corner of the hall and set it down, its light filling a patch of darkness that had forced Claire to guess at her steps earlier. Jacques did not protest, though his brow furrowed, as if unused to such quiet persistence from anyone outside his instruction. From that night forward, the young man, Lucien, as Claire heard Jacques address him once, became a regular presence during her practice. He spoke little,
moving with the unobtrusive efficiency of one accustomed to remaining unnoticed. Yet he could sense his attention, the way his gaze followed the alignment of her steps, the angle of her posture. On occasion, when Jacques turned to adjust the candelabras or pace out the room, Lucien would murmur a suggestion, a slight turn of the heel, a gentler sweep of the arm that often smoothed a motion that had felt awkward before. The hours of repetition stretched long. Her feet ached, blisters forming along her heels, the raw edges stinging against the leather of her shoes. She woke each morning with her calves knotted in dull pain, the muscles unwilling to yield, but she did not complain. Every night she returned, the sound of Jacques' cane on the floor marking the slow, relentless shaping of her movements. As the weeks turned, the palace shifted toward winter. Frost traced the outer edges of the high windows, its lacework glittering faintly under the moon. The air inside the hall grew sharper, each exhaled breath lingering a moment before fading. Servants hurried about the palace with arms full of pine boughs and gilt ornaments. The kitchen smelled of spiced wine and roasted chestnuts. The mid-winter ball was approaching, and even those without invitations could feel its weight. Claire caught fragments of gossip during her daily duties, whispers of foreign envoys, of gowns ordered from Paris at impossible cost, of the orchestra practicing well into the night behind closed doors. The thought of it all pressed against her mind, even as she focused on her training, the music she imagined in the hall overlaying the real strains she sometimes heard from far-off rooms. One evening, Jacques set her to practicing an intricate turn. The movement demanded perfect timing, the crossing and uncrossing of steps like the winding of a delicate mechanism. She concentrated on the shift of her weight, the brush of her skirt against her legs, the muted scuff of her shoe against the floor. She completed the sequence once, twice without faltering. On the third attempt, as she pivoted into the final sweep, a faint vibration trembled beneath her feet. She slowed, realizing it was not her imagination. The floor itself seemed to shiver. Jacques' head snapped up, his eyes narrowing toward the doorway. The hinges were not fully closed. A thin sliver of corridor light spilled across the boards. In that narrow gap, a tall, broad-shouldered figure stood motionless, the outline unmistakably not Lucien's. The figure moved, the door swinging open on a slow, deliberate arc. Candlelight from the hall caught the dark gloss of his hair, the measured poise of his step, and the familiar, unnervingly self-assured set of his shoulders. Prince Etienne entered as if the room itself had been waiting for him. Jacques' cane stilled in his hand. With a curt inclination of the head, he offered a bow that was respectful, but without flourish. A craftsman acknowledging a patron rather than a subject honoring his sovereign.
The prince's gaze swept the hall before settling on Claire. For an instant, she considered lowering her eyes, the safer choice, but something stubborn in her refused. She met his look directly, her breath quiet but quick. He studied her in silence, his expression unreadable, except for the faint curve at one corner of his mouth, a remnant of the same smirk she had seen in the ballroom. Only now it seemed slower to form, as though tempered by calculation. Jacques broke the stillness with an explanation, his voice dry. He claimed he was refining the bearing of the palace staff for ceremonial duties. The prince listened without comment, his eyes never leaving Claire's face. The pause that followed felt as taut as a pulled string. Then, without warning, he began to walk a slow circle around her. His footsteps were soft on the polished boards, the faint scent of bergamot and cedar drifting with him. Claire remained still, though every muscle in her body was alert to his proximity. He spoke idly, almost lazily, about the virtues of grace in posture, about how such qualities could elevate even the most ordinary of appearances. The words might have been praise, yet the tone balanced between genuine observation and quiet mockery. Completing his circuit, He stopped in front of her once more, his gaze resting on the line of her shoulders, as if committing the image to memory. Then, without further remark, he stepped back. His eyes flicked toward Jacques in a silent acknowledgment before he turned and made his way to the door. The movement was unhurried, the ease of a man certain he commanded the attention of every space he occupied. When the door closed behind him, the air in the hall felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the encounter. Jacques did not speak at once. He returned to the center of the floor, rapping the cane sharply against the boards in a call to resume. The lesson continued, but it had changed. His instructions came more quickly now, his corrections sharper. He insisted she maintain her form, not only in motion, but in stillness, as if an unseen gaze were always upon her. Her turns had to be exact, her balance unshakable, her carriage worthy of the scrutiny she would face again. The strain in her muscles deepened, the ache in her back a constant reminder of the long hours she had already endured. In the days that followed, the prince's presence seemed to shadow her beyond the practice hall. She noticed him in the courtyards, his eyes following her as she crossed from one wing to another. Once, while carrying linens through a narrow passage, she glimpsed him at the far end, speaking to a courtier, yet glancing her way between sentences. Servants began to murmur of his interest in the lower ranks, their tones laced with curiosity and speculation. Still, each night she returned to the hall. Jacques drove her through the sequences until her breath came fast, her dress clinging faintly to her back with exertion. She learned to hear the smallest shift in rhythm, to adjust her weight before a step demanded it, to mask the work of movement with the appearance of ease. One late evening, the candelabras burned low, their flames bending in the faint drafts from the windows. Claire completed a long sequence without a single falter, the glide and turn so smooth she could almost forget the pain in her feet. Jacques gave a single approving nod and began to pace, the tip of his cane marking the beats in the air. The distant chime of the great hall's clock began to count the hour. Its deep toll seemed to travel through the walls, vibrating faintly in the floor. At the 12th strike, the main doors to the practice chamber swung open with a burst of cold air. From the threshold came a woman's voice, sharp and authoritative, calling Claire's name. Madame Rochefort filled the doorway like a dark figure cut against the pale spill of corridor light. The severe set of her shoulders and the rigid lines of her black gown gave her presence a formality that silenced the air in the hall. Her voice, though not raised, carried the weight of a command that brooked no delay. Claire turned toward her, still catching her breath from the last sequence. The candelabras flickered, their flames catching the gleam of the housekeeper chatelaine. Without explanation, Madame Rochefort instructed her to follow at once. Jacques' cane lowered to his side, but he did not speak. His gaze followed Claire with an unreadable stillness. The cold of the corridor wrapped around her as soon as she stepped beyond the practice hall. Madame Rochefort's pace was brisk, her heeled shoes striking the marble in an even rhythm. The palace had taken on its nighttime hush, broken only by the faint murmur of distant kitchens and the occasional pop of settling timbers. The scent of beeswax polish lingered in the air, mingling with the sharper tang of the housekeeper's lavender sachet. They moved through a narrower passage where the torches burned lower, casting elongated shadows along the tapestries. Claire's thoughts circled in uneasy loops, each unanswered question pressing harder against her chest. The steward's wing lay ahead, a part of the palace servants rarely entered without summons. Madame Rochefort paused before a heavy oak door, partially concealed by a woven wall hanging. With a single knock, she pushed it open and gestured for Claire to step inside.
Enjoying the story so far? Don't forget to drop a quick comment telling us where you're watching from. And rate this story from 0 to 10. Your feedback means a lot. And if you're liking it, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this.
The steward sat behind an imposing desk of dark wood, the surface scattered with parchment and the faint glint of sealing wax. His eyes, sharp and cool, lifted from the page as she entered. Standing beside the desk, as though he belonged there, was Prince Etienne. The firelight from the hearth cast a glow over the black of his coat, and in his hand he toyed idly with a gilded quill. Claire stopped just inside the threshold, the quiet thump of the door closing behind her sounding far louder than it should. The prince's gaze moved over her with deliberate calm, lacking the sharp amusement of their earlier encounters. The steward's expression was as still as carved stone. The steward spoke first, his voice even. There had been a change to the ceremonial opening of the midwinter ball, he said, and her presence would now be required in an unspecified capacity. His phrasing was deliberate, each word offering no clue beyond the bare fact of the command. Before she could shape a question, the prince added, his tone almost light, that she would discover her role in due course. There was an undercurrent in the words, something not quite threat and not quite promise, that made the small hairs along her neck stir. He regarded her as one might regard a piece newly added to a game board. The steward dismissed her with a nod, turning back to his papers. Claire inclined her head and stepped backward until she reached the door. The polished wood was cool under her fingertips as she slipped into the corridor once more. The air outside the office felt closer, thick with the weight of what had just been said, and more so, what had not been said. Her footsteps sounded too loud against the marble as she began to walk, each echo meeting the silence that pressed in on either side. She turned down a narrower hallway, the light thinning to a dim gold. Her thoughts raced. What task could warrant such a summons, and why in the presence of the prince himself? The memory of his measured gaze seemed to follow her, even here, just beyond sight. At the bend of the corridor, she nearly collided with Lucien. His hands came up quickly, steadying her by the arm before she could draw back. In the quiet, she could hear the faint rush of his breathing, as though he had been searching for her. His grip tightened just slightly, his gray eyes intent on hers. He leaned closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He told her he knew exactly what the prince had planned. Lucien's words settled between them like the weight of a sealed letter, heavy with the promise of unwelcome knowledge. The corridor around them seemed narrower for it, the air still except for the faint hiss of a torch along the wall. Claire's fingers tightened on the fold of her apron, the fabric warm from her hands. She searched his face, finding no trace of hesitation there, only urgency, tempered with the caution of someone who knew the cost of speaking too freely. He told her in a low voice that the prince had arranged for her to be part of the evening's entertainment at the midwinter ball, not as a guest, but as the object of a subtle humiliation. She would be called forward before the gathered court to dance, a task chosen not to honor her, but to ensure that she faltered before the most scrutinizing eyes in France. The thought tightened her chest, the memory of the prince's earlier smirk fresh and stinging. For a moment she could only stand there, her thoughts tumbling too quickly to grasp. The humiliation of that night in the ballroom had been private enough, painful, but quickly swallowed by the tide of music and conversation. This would be different, public, deliberate. She swallowed hard, the air suddenly cold against the back of her throat. Jacques would have to know. Without another word to Lucien, she turned on her heel and retraced her steps through the quiet halls, the muted sound of her shoes on the marble echoing in her ears. When she reached the practice hall, Jacques was still there, coiling a length of silk cord used for marking positions on the floor. His eyes flicked to hers, and in the pause that followed, she understood he had already guessed much of it. That night's lesson was stripped of any trace of gentleness. Jacques drove her through each figure until her limbs trembled, his correction sharper, his demands more exact. He set the pace to match that of the grand waltzes, each measure flowing into the next without pause. Her skirt whispered against the boards as she turned, her breath quickening until the air itself seemed too thin to sustain her. Lucien appeared midway through the practice, carrying a pitcher of water that gleamed in the candlelight. He remained near the wall, silent, his gaze following her steps. Occasionally, when Jacques shifted away, he would tilt his head in subtle encouragement, his eyes narrowing whenever she faltered. Hours blurred, the repetitive strains of the imagined music becoming almost hypnotic. Each time she completed a turn without error, Jacques responded not with praise, but with another, more complex sequence. She learned to keep her chin lifted, her shoulders set, her feet landing soundlessly on the floor. Even the ache in her calves and the rawness of her heels became part of the rhythm, something to be endured rather than avoided. Outside the hall, the palace bristled with preparations. Servants hurried along the corridors with armfuls of pine boughs, silver trays, and bolts of shimmering fabric. The air carried the scent of evergreen and polish, the sounds of distant hammering, and the thump of crates being moved into storerooms. Every corner of the palace seemed to vibrate with anticipation for the coming night. In the kitchens, the smell of spiced wine and sugared almonds drifted through the lower halls. Musicians practiced behind closed doors, the faint strains of violins and flutes threading through the stone passages when the sound escaped. Even the air felt charged, as though the entire palace held its breath. On the eve of the ball, the winter night pressed hard against the windows, leaving frost along the glass like delicate script. Claire's body felt both exhausted and strangely light, her movements sharpened by repetition into something almost instinctive. Jacques dismissed her with a single nod, the candle flames reflecting in his dark eyes. She gathered her things in silence, the weight of the coming day pressing heavily against her. Each step she took down the hall felt measured, the muted sound of her shoes marking the slow approach of whatever awaited her. The next evening arrived as if the hours between had been only a heartbeat. The palace blazed with light, every chandelier spilling gold across the marble floors. In the ballroom, the air shimmered with the mingled heat of bodies and candle flames, the glitter of jewels catching in every mirror. Musicians stood ready, the first notes trembling softly in the air. Claire stood at the edge of the preparations, her simple gown a shadow against the blaze of silk and brocade. Jacques was beside her for a moment, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that was neither comfort nor command, but a reminder. Then the summons came. She was to take her place at the head of the ballroom. The prince was already there, waiting. The sound of her own heartbeat followed her across the marble, a muffled drum beneath the soft swell of the orchestra tuning in the gallery. The ballroom doors loomed ahead, their gilded panels thrown wide to reveal a space so awash in candlelight it seemed to breathe. Every surface gleamed, mirrors flanking the walls, crystal drops on the chandeliers scattering fragments of light, gold leaf catching on the high carved moldings. The air shimmered faintly with heat from the hundreds of flames and the subtle perfume of pine garlands twined along the balconies. The court had arranged itself in a perfect semicircle around the polished floor. Velvet, brocade, and silk rustled in quiet anticipation. The muted colors of winter, deep wine, midnight blue, rich emerald glowing under the light. Conversations fell away as she approached. Claire felt their gazes brush over her like a physical thing, each glance weighing, measuring. At the far end, Prince Etienne stood waiting. His posture was relaxed, but the precision of his stance, feet aligned, hands clasped loosely behind his back, spoke of deliberation. The candlelight played over the sharp lines of his profile and the slight curve at the corner of his mouth. He watched her with an attention that was neither openly hostile nor welcoming, but something more calculating. Jacques' presence at her side was brief. He stopped just short of the open floor. His part was done, at least for this moment. Claire stepped forward alone, the faint rustle of her gown lost in the echoing hush. The prince moved to meet her halfway, every motion as smooth as the opening notes of a dance.
His bow was shallow, a gesture that contained courtesy but not humility. And when he extended his hand, the silence in the room deepened.
She placed her hand in his, the warmth of his grip steady, the faint scent of cedar and bergamot drifting up as he straightened. The musicians in the gallery struck the first chord, a waltz of deliberate elegance. At once he drew her into the opening steps. His lead was firm, assured, his frame guiding hers through the sweep of the first turn. She followed, her mind sliding into the rhythm that had been hammered into her bones over weeks of practice. At first, his movements carried the faintest trace of expectation that she would hesitate, falter, require his correction. But each step she gave him was precise, each turn measured, her posture unyielding under his scrutiny. A flicker of something unreadable passed over his expression. The court, so still at the outset, began to shift in murmurs, the sound low but unmistakable. The floor beneath them felt alive, the boards smooth as glass beneath the glide of her shoes. The prince adjusted his pace, subtly quickening the turn as if to test her. She matched him without a stutter, her eyes lifted just beyond his shoulder, her breathing even. The music swelled, and they traced an unbroken pattern across the center of the room. There was a moment, so slight she almost missed it, when the pressure of his hand at her back eased. She responded instinctively, shifting her posture, her frame guiding his instead of the reverse. It was a lead so smooth that it might have escaped every eye but his. A shadow of surprise touched his expression, and his grip on her hand tightened imperceptibly. The court's murmurs deepened, not with laughter now, but with a sound like collective intake of breath. She could sense their attention sharpening, every movement of the dance laid bare under their inspection. Yet the music carried her forward, the turn and glide becoming almost effortless, as if her body had always known this language. The waltz reached its midpoint, the melody ascending in graceful arcs. She led him into a sweeping figure, the movement broad enough to draw a ripple of movement from the onlookers as they adjusted to follow the pair's path. The prince moved with her, his expression unreadable now, the faint smirk entirely gone. As the final sequence approached, the music gathered itself for the last, most dramatic turn. Claire felt the energy in the room tighten, the anticipation pulling at the edges of the moment. She began the shift into the closing figure, the rhythm steady beneath her feet, and the sharp, crystalline crash of breaking glass rang out from near the great doors, loud enough to cut through the music and turn every head in the room. The shatter of glass rang across the ballroom like a struck bell, bright and sudden against the sweep of the orchestra. The music faltered for a fraction of a beat before the conductor's baton flicked sharply, urging the musicians to continue. The master of ceremonies, stationed near the edge of the floor, gave a discreet signal toward the door, sending a pair of footmen gliding toward the source of the disruption. Claire did not look toward the commotion. Her pulse had leapt at the sound, but her feet kept to the rhythm, her body anchored in the dance. The polished boards beneath her seemed almost to resist distraction, drawing her back into the steps. The prince's frame remained steady, though his gaze flicked once toward the doorway before returning to her. The crowd's attention had been jarred, eyes darting between the dancers and the source of the noise, yet the waltz continued. Claire guided the final sweeping turn into place, her hand light in the prince's, her back straight, each movement deliberate. The murmurs that had begun with curiosity now held a different tone, quieter, tinged with a kind of astonishment that made the air feel sharper. The closing chord hung in the space between them, and when it faded, there was no laughter, no polite cough to dissolve the moment. Applause rose instead, warm and sustained, the sound filling the great hall in a way she had not expected. The prince released her hand slowly, his gaze locked on hers, as if measuring some new understanding. They bowed to the court together. As they straightened, she caught sight of Jacques at the edge of the floor. He stood with his arms folded, his expression unchanged, except for the faint narrowing of his eyes, as though he too were weighing what had just passed. Lucien was further back,
half-shadowed near a marble pillar, his focus fixed solely on her. The evening pressed on, the ballroom shifting back into its rhythm. Couples began to take the floor again, the orchestra easing into a lighter, swifter piece. Claire moved to the edge, the rustle of her skirt brushing her legs as she stepped out of the center's glare. She could still feel the warmth of the prince's grip in her palm, the faint imprint of it stubbornly present. Servants wove among the guests with trays of champagne, their movements practiced and silent. A lady in pale green passed by, offering Claire a look that was neither disdainful nor entirely approving, but weighted with curiosity. Another couple gave her a polite nod in passing. The shift in their demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Something had altered in the space of a single dance. Jacques appeared beside her briefly, murmuring a few quiet words of acknowledgement before stepping away again. He did not linger. His satisfaction showed only in the slight ease of his shoulders as he disappeared into the flow of the evening. Lucien's path through the crowd was slower, careful, as though not to draw notice. Yet she caught the glint of his expression, a restrained but evident pride. Her heart still beat in the rhythm of the waltz, even as other music filled the room. The faces around her blurred into a tapestry of jewels and candlelight, their movements slow and dreamlike after the intensity of the dance. The warmth in the air, the mingling sense of perfume and spiced wine, seemed to sink into her bones, yet beneath it all lay the awareness of the prince. Even when she did not see him, she felt the certainty of his presence somewhere in the room.
She glimpsed him once across the floor, speaking to a group of noblemen. His head inclined as though deep in conversation, but when the group shifted, his eyes found hers for the briefest moment before he turned away again. Time slipped past in measured increments, the rise and fall of music, the soft clink of glasses, the rustle of silk. She danced twice more, each time with partners who led competently, but without the sharp edge of challenge she had felt with the prince. Between dances, she accepted a glass of water from Lucienne, the coolness of it refreshing against the heat in her throat. The chandeliers burned lower as the night deepened, their light softening to a golden haze. Guests began to drift toward the supper rooms, their laughter trailing behind them. Musicians continued to play, though the tempo eased, the music drawing out the final languid stretches of the ball. When the crowd began to thin toward dawn, Claire slipped into a quieter corridor. Her steps slowed, the muffled echo of the ballroom fading behind her. The air here was cooler, touched with the faint scent of stone and extinguished candles. Her muscles ached with a satisfying heaviness, the kind that came from work well done. She stopped near a tall window, the frost on the glass catching the pale light of the first hours before sunrise. The quiet wrapped around her, a stark contrast to the charged air of the ballroom. She let herself breathe, the tension easing from her shoulders. Behind her, from somewhere down the corridor, came the sound of footsteps, measured, unhurried, and drawing steadily nearer. The sound carried in the stillness, the measured tread of leather soles against polished stone. Claire remained by the window, her hands resting lightly on the sill as she watched her own breath cloud the frost-laced glass. She did not turn at once, letting the footsteps close the distance until they slowed and stopped a few paces behind her. When she looked over her shoulder, it was not the prince she found, but Jack. He stood with the air of someone who had sought her out deliberately, his coat buttoned against the lingering chill of the corridor. The faint sheen on his brow and the subtle slack in his shoulders suggested the hour had taken its toll on him as well. He studied her in silence for a moment, his eyes assessing not just her posture, but something deeper, as though measuring the weight of the evening's events against the weeks of relentless practice. At last he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was neither exuberant nor cold, but one of quiet acknowledgment. The words he spoke were few, but their meaning was clear. She had met the challenge set before her. There had been no faltering, no public unmasking of the effort it had taken to bring her to this moment. The court had seen a dancer, not a maid. A faint sound of movement in the distance drew both their gazes briefly down the corridor. Servants extinguishing wall sconces, the soft clink of glassware being gathered. When they looked back to one another, the moment's formality eased. Jack's expression softened, though only slightly, before he gave a brief, almost imperceptible smile. With nothing more to be said, he turned and walked away, his steps retreating into the long hush of the hall. Claire remained at the window for a while, the frost beneath her fingertips cold enough to sting. The rest of the night yielded itself slowly to dawn. The remaining guests lingered in the ballroom and adjoining salons, their conversations quieter now, mellowed by the hour and the wine. Servants moved more freely among them, collecting empty glasses and straightening chairs. Claire returned briefly to the edges of the ballroom, offering help where needed. Her presence met with nods and occasional murmured words from those who might earlier have passed her without notice. Jack stayed to the side, speaking briefly with the master of ceremonies and a pair of musicians before disappearing toward the service passages. Lucien, too, made his way through the dispersing crowd, pausing only to place a glass of water into her hand and to give her a look that carried unspoken satisfaction. The prince remained visible in the room, moving among small knots of nobles with the same effortless authority as before. Yet there was a difference, a faint pause in his manner when his gaze crossed hers, as though his mind lingered a moment longer before returning to the conversation at hand. It was subtle enough that no one else might notice, but Claire felt it with the same certainty as she had felt the floor beneath her feet during the waltz. As the first strands of pale light filtered into the highest windows, the atmosphere shifted. The music softened to a final, unhurried piece, its notes carrying through the thinning company like a farewell. The chandeliers burned lower, their brilliance fading into a gentler gold. Claire gathered a stack of folded linens from a side table and moved toward the corridor, her path taking her once more through the cooler air beyond the ballroom. The scent here was different, less of candle wax and perfume, more of stone and the faint mineral trace of winter air seeping in from unseen drafts. Her steps slowed as she reached a quiet alcove near another tall window. Beyond the glass, the gardens were touched with frost, each hedge and branch edged in silver. The world outside seemed still, as though holding the moment before the sun's arrival. She rested the linens on the sill for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the faintest blush of color marked the coming day. The sound of the last measures of music was faint now, more memory than present. Her body felt heavy with fatigue, but beneath it was a quiet sense of steadiness, a recognition that something had shifted in her standing, however slightly. A soft movement of air stirred behind her, just enough to tell her she was no longer alone. Claire turned, her fingers still resting lightly on the stack of linens, and found the prince standing a few steps away. His coat was unbuttoned now, the black wool falling open to reveal the soft creases in his white shirt. His cravat loosened just enough to suggest the long hours he had spent in the ballroom. The air between them held the faint mingling sense of the night, pine from the garlands, candle wax, and the lingering trace of bergamot and cedar that seemed part of him. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied her with a focus that felt different from the measured scrutiny she had endured before. The edges of his expression were softened by the pale light seeping in through the frost-glazed windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, each word carrying the weight of having been considered before leaving his lips. He acknowledged what she had done in the ballroom, before the court, before him. His tone was stripped of mockery. There was no arched brow, no curve of a smirk. The words held respect, and something quieter beneath it,
as if he were admitting the shift in how he saw her. She held his gaze, unsure whether to step back or forward, the stillness of the corridor wrapping around them like a binding thread. The faint sound of movement reached them from far away, the slow dragging of a chair, the closing of a distant door. But here the world felt reduced to the breadth of the space they shared. The frost on the window at her back caught the dim gold light from a nearby sconce, etching faint shadows across her sleeve. She was acutely aware of her own breathing, the soft rise and fall of it in time with the quiet around them. He moved closer, his steps unhurried, the sound of them muted against the worn carpet runner beneath his feet. When he stopped, he was near enough that she could see the subtle strain at the corners of his eyes, the sign of a man who had danced and spoken and listened until the night had pressed itself fully upon him. No challenge passed between them now. There was no audience, no court to witness and weigh each glance or word. His gaze held her steadily, and after a pause, he extended his hand, not in command, not in test, but as an offering. The gesture was quiet, almost tentative, and yet it carried the same elegance as when he had led her onto the ballroom floor. Her own hand lifted almost before she had decided to give it. His palm was warm around hers, the contact firm without pressure. The faint sound of her breath caught in her throat as he guided her into the first slow steps of a waltz. There was no music here, only the rhythm they kept between them, the measured shift of weight, the quiet glide across the narrow stretch of floor. The corridor seemed to recede, the tall windows and flickering sconces reduced to the periphery of sight. His movements were slower than they had been in the ballroom, each turn unhurried, as if to mark the moment rather than display it. She felt the subtle lead of his frame, the steadying pressure of his hand at her back, and the way he adjusted to her steps as if the dance belonged equally to them both. They moved in silence, the only sound the faint brush of fabric and the soft tap of his shoes on the stone. Time felt altered here, as if the night had given them a pocket in which to remain suspended, untouched by what had come before or what would follow. The light from the window deepened slightly, touched with the first pale silver of morning. When the final step carried them to a stop, neither of them released the other's hand at once. The pause that followed was quiet, but dense with meaning, the kind that needed no words to hold its shape. His gaze lingered on hers, and in it she saw none of the careless arrogance that had marked their first encounter, only the clear acknowledgment of something neither could dismiss. The pale blush of dawn crept higher across the frosted glass, softening the edges of the world beyond. Inside, the air between them was still warm from the dance. He did not step back. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.